Hello and welcome to the second of the syntax seminars. This time we're going to introduce a particular theory of syntax and phrase structure called X-bar theory. And in particular this week we're going to be concentrating on notions called heads and complements, and just what they are we'll see as we proceed. Let's first of all introduce the first rule of X-bar theory. Here it is here, XP with the arrow, X and YP in brackets. Okay, now as you can see, this is a phrase structure rule of the type that we introduced last week. Remember, phrase structure rules have this arrow with one symbol to one side and more symbols onto the other side. Here the XP is on the left hand side of the arrow, and the X and the YP in brackets are on the right hand side. And what that means is that the XP is at the top of the phrase, and the X and the YP are drawn underneath it and connected to the XP with branches. Now, this differs from the rules that we looked at last week because they were more specific. They were to do with verb phrases and noun phrases and preposition phrases, etc., etc. But this rule is special in as much as it uses X's and Y's instead of verbs and nouns and everything. And these are what we call category variables. What that means is that they vary over the categories that they can refer to. In other words, X and Y can stand for any category. X could be V, could be N, could be D, could be anything. Okay, they vary over all of the range of possible categories. Now, that means that this rule is both simple and general. It's simple precisely because it is so general that you only need a few of these rules to account for all of the different types of phrases. They apply to every single phrase. Now that also means, given that these are the rules that apply to all phrases, that they're also extremely restrictive. They say what phrases can look like and what they can't look like. Every phrase has to conform to precisely this pattern that the rule itself defines. Okay, so our first question we have to ask is about the X then. What is X? Well, here's the structure that the phrase structure rule produces. I've got an XP at the top, an X underneath it, and a YP underneath it, and both X and YP are joined to XP with branches. Now, as we've said, X is a category variable, and therefore it can stand for any category, N, V, D, P, anything. Now note, X as the symbol appears on both sides of the arrow. Now obviously the XP stands for a phrase of category X, whatever that is. X underneath stands for a word. Okay, so just the X there is a word position. Now, because X is on both sides of the arrow, what we have then is that whatever X stands for will be the same category for the phrase and the word inside the phrase. We call that word then the head of the phrase. Essentially what we're saying is that a verb phrase will have a verb in it, and a noun phrase will have a noun in it, and a preposition phrase will have a preposition in it. Okay, and note, because the rule is general and because it is restrictive in this way, we are claiming, therefore, that all phrases are restricted to having heads. So that seems a reasonable restriction, but okay, we're dealing with very general notions here. So a question that arises quite soon into this is, well, given any particular phrase, then how do we know what the category of the phrase is? Now, in order to see how this works, we have to talk about our grammatical knowledge and the fact that it comes in two different types of things. Part of our grammatical knowledge is to do with rules and how rules that tell you how to combine words, the kind of thing that we're looking at here with this X-bar rule that tells us to combine a head with some other phrase to form another phrase. Now, being a rule, it's something which is very general. It applies across the language. But that isn't the only thing you need to know in order to know a language. you have to know about words and the properties of words. And those properties of words are not rule governed. They are idiosyncratic. That means they are randomly assigned. To see this, let's have a look at a few words and their properties. Okay, so here we've got dog, smile, in, and large. Now, the properties of dogs is that it's pronounced dog. There's no reason why that word has to be pronounced dog, and in many languages the word isn't pronounced. It means dog. Well, okay, I'm representing this here with a hashtag and the capital letters there. However we are to represent meanings, let's just assume it's this. So there is a connection between the pronunciation, dog, and the meaning. Again, that association is completely arbitrary. There's no reason why the word pronounced dog should be related to the word that means dog. Finally, another thing we know about this word is that it's a noun. Now, again, this isn't as straightforward as you might think, that, oh, well, the meaning of the dog determines its category. It's not always true. For example, this word dog can actually be used as a verb. You can dog somebody, which not every noun can be used as a verb like that. Okay, so belief is a noun, cannot be used as a verb. Okay, so not every noun can be used as a verb. It's an idiosyncratic property of this particular noun that it can. Moving on, we've got smile. Smile is pronounced smile. It means whatever smile means, and it's a verb. Again, all of those are idiosyncratic properties of that word. Again, note smile is a verb that can be used as a noun, and not all verbs can be used as nouns. We also have in, pronounced in, meaning in, and it's a preposition. And large, pronounced large, meaning large, it's an adjective. Now, you have to know all of these pieces of information about every single word of the language that you know. And because it's not rule governed, because it's idiosyncratic and non-predictable, you essentially have to learn all this information piece by piece, each word at a time, and you have to store that information somewhere. Now, the place where we store information about lexical items or words, we call it the lexicon. Okay, so part of our grammatical knowledge is to do with the knowledge of lexical properties stored in the lexicon, and that comes together with the rules of combination to produce our total understanding of a language's grammatical system. Okay, so coming back to our X-bar rule here, how do we know what the X actually stands for in any particular case? Well, let's go back to the structure that we produce with this rule. Now, we've got here a word position, the X, the head position. Suppose we insert a word into it, any random word. Let's put dog in there. Now, dog is a word which we know, by knowing its lexical properties, is a noun. Now, if we are going to insert a noun into the head position, that must mean that that head position is a noun position. Furthermore, by the X-bar rule, if the head is the noun, we know that the whole phrase is a noun phrase, because every phrase contains a word of the same category of the phrase, every word. Okay, had we chosen another word like smile as a verb, then the whole thing would be a verb phrase. So what we can see here is that it's the category of the word of the head, it's sitting in the head position, that determines the category of the whole phrase. Now, this process, this relationship between the words that occupy these positions and the categories that get infiltrated, as it were, into the structure is known as projection. We say that heads project their categories onto the phrase. So, given that we know that dog is a noun, it projects that noun category up onto the head position, and if the head is a noun, then it projects that up onto the phrasal position. So the relationship between the head and the phrase is one of projection. Okay, let's turn our attention now to look at the YP. What we call this thing a complement. It's a phrase. It's a YP, not just a Y, a phrase. The other thing that we know about it is that it's optional. That's the brackets. The brackets around YP show that it's optional. Note, the head is not optional. The head is obligatory. Every phrase has a head, but not every phrase has to have a complement within it. This phrase, the complement, follows the head, and it's selected by the head. Now, what that means, we need to look at some examples to show you what selection is all about. It's a fact that heads impose restrictions on what phrases can appear in that complement position following them. Different heads will have different requirements as to what their complements can be. So here we've got a list of verbs: smile, love, reach, and say. Okay, and note, each one of them is followed by a different element. Smile, for example, is a verb that doesn't have to be followed by anything. John smiled is a perfectly good sentence all by itself, where there is nothing sitting in the complement position of the verb. Love, on the other hand, has a noun phrase sitting in its complement position. So love takes a noun phrase complement. Reach is different again. It doesn't have a noun phrase, but it has a preposition phrase following it. Reach for the knife. And say is the kind of verb that is followed not by any particular phrase, but it's followed by a sentence. Mary smiled in this case. John said, Mary smiled. Say is the verb that takes a sentence as its complement. Now note, this is a restrictive relationship between the head and the complement. That is, you can't just have any old complement with any old head. If you try putting the wrong kind of complement with the wrong kind of head, it ends up as being ungrammatical. You can't say, for example, follow a verb like smile with a noun phrase. You can't say John smiled Mary. Or you can't leave the noun phrase off a verb like love. You can't say John loves. Or give a verb like reach a sentence complement and get John reached, Mary smiled. Or give a verb like say a prepositional phrase complement. You can't say John said for the knife. Okay, so clearly different heads select for different complements. Now clearly this is part of our understanding of the properties of these words. It's something we know about smile, love, reach, and say as to what their complements can and must be. Therefore, that's going to have to be represented in our lexicon. So a verb like smile, we know that it's pronounced smile, it means smile. It's a verb, but it's also a verb that doesn't have a complement. And that's represented here at the end of this lexical entry in the square brackets with this symbol, a zero with a line through it. This is called the null symbol, means nothing. Traditionally, we refer to those kinds of verbs as intransitive verbs. Intransitive verbs are verbs that don't have complements. Love, on the other hand, selects for an NP complement. NP complements are traditionally referred to as objects, and verbs which have objects traditionally are referred to as transitive verbs. Reach is the kind of verb that has a prepositional phrase complement, and they are traditionally referred to as prepositional verbs. Say is the kind of verb that has a sentence or a clausal complement. There's no traditional term for such verbs. Okay, well, we're still a bit vague as to how this all works in a particular sentence. So, for example, if we've got a sentence, we're looking at it, how do we know, given all of the words in the sentence are there, and we know what categories are, but how do we know what word is the head of which phrase? How do we know what the category of the phrase is until we know what the head of the phrase is, because it's the head that determines the category? Well, let's have a look. You might think that it works like this. All we need to do is look at a phrase and find the most important word, and that will be the head. Well, yes, to some extent, but the problem is that heads are important in certain respects, but not always in all respects. There are other respects in which a head might not be the most important word at all. Let me give you an example where a head is important in all respects. Take, for example, verbs inside verb phrases. Okay, I think it's fairly clear if you take a verb phrase and you see there's a verb in it. Well, yeah, the verb is going to be the head. Why? Well, it seems fairly obvious that the verb seems to be the most important word in that phrase. Take some examples like this. Reach for the knife. Said Mary smiled. Reach for the knife. What's it about? It's about reaching for something. Reach seems to be the most important word there. Obviously, we've got for and the and knife. They also carry meaning, but their meaning seem to be somehow secondary to reach. Reach is the most important word in that phrase. Said Mary smiled. Well, obviously, Mary smiled is a meaning, it's a sentence all by itself. But inside the phrase said Mary smiled, what we're talking about here is saying. Something is being said, and Mary smiled is what is being said. So here the important semantic element is the verb. Okay, so in this particular case, we can see that there is a coincidence between what is important syntactically, being the head, determining the category of the phrase, etc., etc., and also semantically in terms of contributing the most weight of meaning to the phrase. That, however, is not always the case. Let's have a look at a case where it isn't so. Take the phrase to London. Well, here we've got two words, to, which is a preposition, London, which is a noun. Okay, which one of these is the head? If it's the noun that's the head, London, then clearly this is going to be a noun phrase. If it's the preposition that's the head, then it's going to be a preposition phrase. Which one's which? Okay, well, looking at in terms of the notion of importance, what's the most important word here? And you might first of all assume, oh, London. London here is the most important word because it clearly carries the most semantic content. Okay, to London is talking about London. The to is sort of adding something to that meaning. Well, if that's true, if this is a noun phrase, then we predict it should behave like other noun phrases. Okay? In particular, it should have the same distribution as other noun phrases. That means it should go into the same positions that any noun phrase can go in. It's the category of something that determines the position in which it can go. And therefore, if this thing has the same category as a noun phrase, it could go in any position where we can find a noun phrase in a sentence. Is that true? Well, here we've got a sentence, John loves Mary, and we can see there are two positions where we find noun phrases, John and Mary. John is sitting in the subject position. Mary, as we just discussed, is in the object position. Okay, so those are two noun phrase positions. Now, if that's true, that to London is a noun phrase, we would expect it to be able to appear in subject and object position. Loves is a word that selects for a noun phrase complement, and if to London is a noun phrase, it should be fine. But as we see, John loves to London doesn't work, and neither does to London loves Mary. You simply cannot put a phrase like to London into the same position as you can put other noun phrases, which indicates that this actually isn't a noun phrase. Okay, well, the only other option we've got is that it must be a preposition phrase because, well, the preposition is the only other word in the phrase, and furthermore, every phrase must have a head. So given that London isn't the head, too must be the head, and therefore this must be a preposition phrase. Have we got any evidence in favour of that? Well, if it's a preposition phrase, we should be able to replace this whole phrase with a single preposition. Why is that? Well, because if we have a phrase that contains just a preposition, given that every phrase must have a head, that preposition must be the head, and therefore that phrase must be a preposition phrase. Okay, so if this to London is a preposition phrase, we should be able to replace it with other preposition phrases, specifically with one which only has a preposition in it. Can we do that? Well, have a look at this case. John went to London. Now we've got our preposition for our phrase to London, and we've got John went out. Out is a preposition. It heads, obviously, a prepositional phrase, and therefore the conclusion is that to London must be a preposition phrase. Okay. Now, with that in mind, let's turn our attention to one more phrase, which so far we've been thinking of as a noun phrase. Okay, and that's something like this: a man. It's got two words in it. It's got a determiner, and it's got a noun in it. And our assumption that this is a noun phrase then is an assumption that the noun is the head of the phrase. Why should we want to expect that? Well, clearly, man is the most important word in that phrase. A man. Okay, has some sort of semantic contribution, but it's clearly nowhere near as much as the noun contributes. Okay, but as we've just seen, it's not always the case that the most important syntactic word is the most important semantic word. The two things are not always the same. So we need more evidence. Is the noun really the head of this phrase? One fairly straightforward piece of evidence is that we could replace a man with a single word, which is a noun. And as we've just discussed with the preposition phrase, that seems to settle it. Okay, if you can replace a phrase with a single word, then that single word presumably must be the head of the phrase, and we can look at the category of that and say, that's what the category of this whole phrase is. So the fact that you can replace a man with something like men, a plural noun, would seem to suggest that yes, a man is a noun phrase because it can contain just a noun in it. So, we seem to have settled that issue fairly straightforwardly. If it weren't for the fact that there are some problematic issues too. The main problem is this. We could have also replaced the whole phrase a man with something else, specifically something known as a pronoun, as in I saw him in the room. Now, the problem is, well, what's the category of a pronoun? Okay, well, first thing you might think is, well, it's called a pronoun, and its name therefore seems to give its category away. Okay, the fact that it's called a pronoun seems to indicate that it's some kind of noun, and therefore what's all the problem? The problem is this, that names are not always good indications of the properties of things. After all, we call a strawberry, despite the fact that it has nothing to do with straw and isn't even a berry. Okay, so names can be misleading, and just because a pronoun is called a pronoun doesn't necessarily mean to say it's a noun. We need some evidence as to what category pronouns belong to. Now, obviously, if they are nouns, we would expect them to distribute like nouns. They should go into the same positions that we can find other nouns in. Now, one of the places we can find a noun is following a determiner. We can have a house, the man, an Albert. Yeah, okay, that's not a typical thing, but under the right circumstances, you can put determiners with proper nouns. Like Albert and John, things like this. As in, I met an Albert the other day, or an Albert is what we need now, etc. We can do that kind of thing under the right circumstances. The observation is, however, under any circumstances, you can never get a determiner in front of a pronoun. Determiners and pronouns are essentially in complementary distribution. You can't have the two of them together. Okay. Now, the first conclusion we come from that is we arrive at from that is that pronouns don't seem to be nouns. They don't distribute like nouns, and so they can't be of the same category of them. The observation, however, is that they are in complementary distribution with determiners. Wherever you can have a pronoun, typically you can't have a determiner, and wherever you have a determiner, typically you can't have a pronoun. So you can say he left, but you can't say the left. You can say the boy left, but you can't say he boy left. Okay, so where you can have the determiner, you can't have the pronoun, and vice versa. Now, complementary distribution is usually taken to mean that two elements are trying to sit in the same position. And obviously, two things can't go into one position. So you've either got to have one or the other. You can't have both of them there. And if two things are trying to sit in the same position, they must have the same category, because it's category that determines the positions in which they sit. So the conclusion we come to from this observation is that not only are pronouns not nouns, they are actually determiners. Other indications that that's true is that there's quite a few words that seem to be ambiguous between pronouns and determiners. They have a determiner use and they also have a pronoun use. So there's a clear connection between those two categories. You can say something like, I like some films, where some preceding the noun seems to be a determiner. But you could also say, I like some, where it seems to be behaving like a pronoun. I didn't take any credit. Any seems to be a determiner. Or I didn't take any, where it seems to be a pronoun. We gave most chocolate to them, or we gave most to them. So most can either be determiner or pronoun. So there's a clear connection between these two categories. Finally, there are some personal pronouns which typically are in complementary distribution with determiners, but there are a few of them, that can actually be used as determiners. The pronoun we, for example, as in we scientists, or we linguists, or we humans. Okay, and you, particularly with derogative sort of phrases like you fools or you idiot or something like that. So we scientists warned you fools about this phenomena or something like this. So all of the evidence that we have there seems strongly to point in the direction of saying that pronouns are determiners, not nouns. Now, here's the problem then. If we have a pronoun and it's a determiner and it's the only word in the phrase, it seems to be heading a determiner phrase. Whereas if we have a single noun, like a plural noun, men, being a noun, it heads the phrase and it heads a noun phrase. But that can't be right, because these two phrases have the same distribution. And as we've said, things with the same distribution must have the same category. They are being put into the same structural position, and it's the category that determines that structural position. So you can say they took men off the boats, or they took them off the boats. Wherever you can have men, you can have a pronoun. Okay, so it can't be right that they are two different categories heading two different types of phrases. They must be the same phrase. We can solve this issue if we make a rather more abstract assumption about the structure of one of them. In particular, we could claim that plural nouns are actually not nouns which appear without determiners, but they do appear with a determiner. It's just that the determiner itself is not pronounced. So they took men off the boats is really they took some men off the boats, but you just don't pronounce the determiner that accompanies it. Now, if that's the case, then these two phrases are uniformly determiner phrases. They both have determiners as heads with them. Now, if we make that assumption, we can actually account for some strange observation about these nouns that appear all by themselves. That is, they typically have properties of either being indefinite or definite. So, for example, plural nouns, when they appear by themselves, are often interpreted an indefinite phrase. Now, why would that be? It can't be anything to do with the noun itself, because nouns themselves are neither definite nor indefinite. It's the determiner that determines whether or not a phrase is definite or indefinite. So, for example, if we have some men were left behind, that's an indefinite phrase because the determiner some is indefinite, whereas the men were left behind, the men is definite because the determiner the is definite. Note, men can appear in both, so the word men is neither definite nor indefinite. So when you use men seemingly by itself, The fact that it is indefinite shows us that there really is an indefinite determiner there. It's just that it's not pronounced. Okay, so the structures of these phrases that we've been looking at then looks like this. Some of them are headed by determiners, i.e. pronouns, and those pronouns are heads that don't take complements. They are just single words that appear inside the phrase, a DP. Others, we have both a determiner and a noun phrase complement. Note, men here in the men is a phrasal element. It sits in the complement position, and the thing we know about complements is that they're phrases. We could have extended that phrase like the students of linguistics or something like that. But anyway, there is an NP there, but it's not the whole thing. The whole thing is actually a determiner phrase headed by the determiner. And cases where we see just a single noun by itself, well, there really is a determiner there heading the DP. It's just lacking in pronunciation. And here we've indicated that lack of pronunciation by using this null symbol again. Okay, so to summarize quickly what we've just been through, X-bar theory claims that all phrases have heads. It imposes this restriction that they're only phrases which have heads. There are no phrases which lack heads. The head projects its categorical properties onto the phrase that they are the heads of. Phrases may or may not have complements, and that all depends on the properties of the head. If the head selects for a complement, then there will be a complement. Furthermore, the complement will be the same category that is selected for. Some heads will select for DP complements or prepositional phrase complements or VP complements or whatever. The head determines what the complements are going to be through this property of selection. Sometimes heads go unpronounced, and that does throw a spanner in the works in some cases, but we will see whenever this appears, there will always be reason to believe that the head exists. Even if you can't see it, there will be other reasons, other evidence that it is actually there. And, well, precisely because of this, it seems that we've been mistaken up until now in calling some phrases noun phrases when really they are not noun phrases. The head is not the noun in that phrase. The head is actually a determiner, and therefore these things are determiner phrases or DPs. And that's what we're going to be claiming from now on. Okay, that's it. I'll see you in class. Bye.